And welcome to NTD Business. I'm Don Ma. A few updates today. T-Mobile plans to lay off 5,000 employees in coming weeks. The CEO made the announcement on Thursday. In a letter to employees, the CEO said the layoffs will take place over the next 5 weeks. The cuts will largely affect corporate and back office jobs. About 7% of T-Mobile's total staff will be cut. It comes after months of mass layoff announcements at other tech companies. That's including Microsoft and Meta. They are grappling with an uncertain economic environment, as with everyone. Shares of Walt Disney fell 3.9% on Thursday, closing at their lowest level in nearly 9 years. With some investors betting that further price drops is on the cards in the next few months. Here are the details.
Disney isn't a fun ride for investors right now. Shares in the Mickey Mouse firm sank 3.9% on Thursday. That took them to their lowest in almost 9 years. And futures markets suggest traders are betting the slump isn't done yet. Disney investors are scrutinizing a turnaround plan laid out by boss Bob Iger. He's promised price hikes for its streaming services, as well as more ads and cost-cutting. In an earnings report earlier this month, Iger said the entertainment company faced a challenging environment. The stock has fallen more than 5% since. A big shake-up may also lie ahead. In a July interview, Iger said television, including its stations and cable channels, may not be core to Disney. Reuters sources say the comment sparked a frenzy of speculation among bankers and private equity players over a possible move. Iger later fueled the conjecture when he said Disney might seek a partner for ESPN, its marquee sports brand. He said film studios, theme parks and streaming would be the core drivers for Disney over the coming years.
And an update on gas prices. According to AAA, the average price for a gallon of gas fell 4 cents last week to $3.83. That came despite growing demand, which usually increases prices. But the overall price of oil has fallen, and that influences prices at the pump. Experts warn these prices could be short-lived, though. Demand generally spikes on Labor Day weekend, driving them upward. Also, hurricane season is getting into full gear. When weather forces refineries on the Gulf Coast to shut down, gas prices can jump sharply as well. The current price of gas is 24 cents higher than last month, but 5 cents less than a year ago. And the U.S. Justice Department sued Elon Musk-owned rocket and satellite company SpaceX on Thursday for allegedly discriminating against asylum recipients and refugees in hiring. Here's more.
3, 2, 1.
Business is booming at SpaceX. Recent launches by Elon Musk's rocket company included one lifting a new space telescope for Europe. But the company faces a legal headache. The US Justice Department says it's suing SpaceX over allegations it discriminated against asylum seekers and refugees in hiring. In a statement, it says the company routinely discouraged such applicants and refused to hire or even consider them. It says SpaceX job ads wrongly claimed that posts were only open to US citizens and green card holders. Officials also cited online posts by Musk. In June 2020, he said on Twitter, now called X, that people required at least a green card to work at the firm. He said that was because rockets are considered advanced weapons technology. In a new post, Musk said the lawsuit was the weaponization of the DOJ for political purposes. He said the company had repeatedly been told it faced restrictions on who it could hire at risk of violating international arms trafficking law. The Justice Department said it would seek back pay and other remedies for people who were denied employment. The lawsuit will also demand civil penalties.
And in one of the biggest acquisitions in fast food history, the Subway sandwich chain now has a new owner. After 6 months of looking for a buyer, Subway has been purchased by the private equity firm Roark Capital. The move ends the chain's near 6-decade run as a family-owned business. Roark holds investments in a number of large restaurant chains, including Arby's, Buffalo Wild Wings, and Sonic. Terms of the deal weren't disclosed. However, the Wall Street Journal reported the purchase price was around $9.6 billion. Market insiders say Rourke will have to make some big changes to subway locations and menus to improve sales and profitability. And some news relating to China. Around 1 million Tibetan children are in Chinese state-run boarding schools. Now the U.S. is stepping up sanctions against the Chinese Communist regime. NTD Sam Wang has the details on that and bills to protect U.S. land as well.
Washington plans to block the visas of Chinese officials who are involved in the forced assimilation of Tibetan children. According to the State Department, it impacts current and former Chinese officials, in particular those who are involved in state-run boarding schools in Tibet. The UN reports that around 1 million Tibetan children have been forcibly removed from their families due to China's re-education policy. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Tuesday, these coercive policies seek to eliminate Tibet's distinct linguistic, cultural, and religious traditions among younger generations of Tibetans. He then urged the regime to end the repressive policy all throughout China. Last December, Washington also sanctioned 2 high-ranking Chinese officials over human rights violation in Tibet. On the local level, lawmakers across 33 states have put forth 81 bills this year, all aiming to restrict Chinese citizens from buying properties near military bases. Some of those bills are now passed in states such as Alabama, Idaho, and Virginia. Those in support see the land as a national security interest, noting that the Chinese regime could use the land to spy on critical U.S. infrastructure nearby. Additionally, they also fear that the country's food supply could be in jeopardy if too much agricultural lands ended up in the hands of foreign entities. The bills gained attention back in February following a Chinese spy balloon flying across the U.S. before Washington shot it down. Sam Wang, NTD News.
And a California man was detained for stealing $1.8 million in luxury items from a hotel room. He then allegedly sold the stolen goods to a Florida buyer. The victims were from Brazil and staying at the Peninsula Beverly Hills Hotel in California for a fashion event. Robson DeCastro, the thief, said he didn't know the suspect. DeCastro took an Uber to the hotel and allegedly tricked hotel staff into giving him a key to the victim's room. He made multiple Uber trips to the hotel and also charged food to the victim's room account when he ate at the hotel bar. Authorities say he messaged a buyer for the stolen goods over Instagram. But the buyer's store was located in Miami, and DeCastro allegedly brought the stolen items there. Authorities tracked him using GPS data from his Uber rides and via Apple AirTags located in one of the suitcases. Authorities also discovered DeCastro is being investigated for a separate hotel theft. And Boeing has recently identified a new 737 MAX quality problem involving supplier Spirit Aerosystems. It has resulted in improperly drilled holes on the aircraft. This is according to the plane maker. Here's more.
Boeing has a new headache over its 737 MAX jets. The US giant said late Wednesday that it had found a fresh defect, and that could mean another hit to deliveries of the company's big seller. The problem involves wrongly drilled holes in parts from key supplier Spirit Aerosystems. Boeing says that will definitely hit the delivery of jets to Malaysian Airlines, which had been scheduled for the end of the month. It's assessing whether the problem will now cause it to miss a target for 400 deliveries of the 737 family planes this year. So far, the firm thinks the issue is limited to one specific MAX model, but it's assessing if older jets could also face the same concern. It's unclear how many planes will need to be fixed. The defect is just the latest issue to hit the 737 MAX, which has had a troubled history. Back in April, Boeing said Spirit had improperly installed brackets that hold on the vertical tail of the aircraft. Earlier, the MAX was grounded for almost 2 years following 2 fatal crashes that killed 346 people. The crashes were traced to flight control systems which have since been fixed.
Wells Fargo has agreed to pay a $35 million civil penalty to settle U.S. charges that the company overcharged advisory fees, the Securities and Exchange Commission said on Friday. The SEC said it charged Wells Fargo Clearing Services and Wells Fargo Advisory Financial Network for overcharging more than 10,900 investment advisory accounts, more than $26.8 million in advisory fees. The SEC alleged that Wells Fargo and its predecessor firms overcharged certain clients who opened accounts prior to 2014 for advisory fees through the end of December 2022. Wells Fargo settled without admitting or denying the charges, the SEC said in a statement. Wells Fargo paid affected account holders about $40 million, including interest, to reimburse them for the overcharging, according to the statement. And here's a question. Has tipping gone too far? The screens are seemingly everywhere now: coffee shops, sports stadiums, even self-service kiosks asking customers if they want to offer a tip. It's leading to some confusing moments at the checkout counter. Here's more.
This screen is stressful for many.
Does the flip of the screen feel like a lot of pressure?
It does, and they give you options like 10, 15, 20, even with like Uber, Dash, and like Grubhub, all of it. Like everything's tip, tip, tip.
Do you think that tipping has gotten out of control?
Yes.
Tips are part of American culture, meant to be a thank you for good service. But today, more and more Americans are confronted with the question, would you like to add a tip?
It is tricky everywhere, right? Like if you're at a coffee shop, if you're at the hairstylist, if you're coming out of a taxi, like I don't know the rules then, and I often don't know what to tip.
A recent study found that in a high number of cases, participants who were presented with a tip screen had more negative emotions to the payment experience than those that didn't. And it wasn't even a real-world scenario.
Let's say you go to a coffee shop and all they do is just twist around the laptop. It's like, why am I tipping?
But the small group we spoke to said more often than not, they do end up tipping.
I put $1 or $2. I don't mind it. As long as it's not a lot, I'll just put it because I don't mind. At the end of the day, I'm helping out other people.
This is Provisions on State, a butcher shop. There's no table service, no cooking or serving. Yet, they'll ask you if you'd like to tip.
Men and women have a knowledge base that they're sharing and taking care to share with the guests that come through the door. And they're not pressured to tip, but they want to because they're paying for a service provided.
Does anyone have any knife work I can grab?
Emily Mingrone owns the butcher shop and 2 restaurants in New Haven, Connecticut. At the restaurants, her front-of-house staff make the state's tipped minimum wage, $6.38 an hour. Tips bring them to $40 an hour on average. But the back-of-house staff make half that and aren't eligible for tips. 8 states have abolished the tipped minimum wage, which in some is as low as $2.13 an hour. The National Restaurant Association is fighting against it, calling it a top issue. The group One Fair Wage is moving legislation and ballot measures to end the tipped minimum wage in 25 other states, including Illinois.
That's how I live, is with tips.
Destiny Fox works in 2 Chicago restaurants. She's saving up for school. She makes just above the state's tipped minimum wage, taking home $9.40 an hour. Tips add 80% to her take-home pay. Without it,
it wouldn't give me the means to live, to pay my bills, to eat, and to do the things that I'm planning on doing, school, and I mean, it's everything.
Meanwhile, the Warner Bros. Movie studio will delay the planned November release of a big-budget Dune sequel until March. A studio spokesperson said on Thursday, because its stars cannot promote the movie during the Hollywood actors' strike. Here's more.
Warner Brothers said Thursday they will delay the big-budget Dune sequel from November to March because its stars cannot promote the movie during the Hollywood actors' strike.
I will do what must be done.
Dune Part 2 stars Zendaya and Timothée Chalamet, based on the original 1965 novel about a battle on a desert planet to control a precious resource. It's one of the most anticipated films of the year, and the decision to delay it deals a blow to major theater chains still trying to recover from a 3-year slump. The Dune move has caused a ripple effect of further delays across the studio's release schedule. A new Godzilla movie set to premiere the same day as Dune's new March 15th release date will be pushed to April, and an animated Lord of the Rings film originally set for April was in turn moved to December next year. The strike by the Writers Guild of America, which began May 2nd, has also shut down most production of scripted television shows and some movie shoots. And since the SAG-AFTRA Actors Union joined the strike mid-July, top stars have refused to promote upcoming projects, forcing big movie studios, including Warner Brothers and Sony Pictures, to adjust their film schedules in the absence of celebrities to hit red carpets and talk shows to help build buzz. Despite the major boost this summer from blockbuster smashes like Barbie and Oppenheimer, overall moviegoing this year remains below pre-2020 levels.
And legendary Star Trek actor William Shatner has been spending some time exploring the new frontier of artificial intelligence. Here's the report.
It's an honor to interact with the legendary William Shatner. How can I assist you today?
Star Trek star William Shatner goes head-to-head with an artificial intelligence chatbot
that are known for
asking a range of questions from the deep to the trivial.
Are you afraid of Doberman dogs?
And receives somewhat surprising results.
Love is a powerful force that brings joy, compassion, and a deep connection between individuals, transcending boundaries and filling our lives with warmth and meaning.
Meet Protobot, a hologram developed by Proto in partnership with Code Baby, which combines holographic visuals and generative AI to allow users to interact and converse with a robot.
Protobot is the personification of what is commonly known as conversational AI.
Proto's principal hardware architect, Rafi Krasek.
We are now putting a person, a face, a presence to the interaction. And the interaction is very natural. You're not typing in, waiting for a response. You're having a conversation. As you saw with Mr. Shatner, it feels very comfortable.
Okay.
Understood.
Proto hopes that the device will be used by educators, scientists, and businesses to come up with new strategies and ideas. It may even be able to help diagnose medical problems. On an everyday level, it could be used for companionship, offering support and advice.
What have I learned? I think it was more emotional in that the more I talked to it, the more sense it made to me. I thought, you could do things, you could make things work with this seemingly bendable invention.
Write a poem.
Witness the robot's response when asked to compose a poem about a man, his dogs, and a peanut butter sandwich.
In a serene meadow, a man did reside, with loyal dogs who wagged by his side. He made a sandwich, oh so grand, with peanut butter, on bread it was planned.
There we go. So
that's stupefying.
The Protobot will be released in September 2023. Costs range from around $6,500 for the smaller unit and $65,000 for the life-size one.
Holograms be born.
So what's Shatner's take after interacting with Protobot?
Well, we're at a crossroads everywhere. We're going to burn up or we're going to exceed all expectation. And this is part of the crossroads. This will help us decide the correct way to move on, or it will defeat us.
And finally, more than $1 trillion. That's how much the U.S. is expected to borrow for the current quarter. Here to talk to me about this is Derek Georgino, NTD contributor and risk consultant in the greater LA area. I mean, to me, this is just a huge amount of debt in such a short time. I think a discussion about debt can be very nuanced, and we'll go into more detail later. But first, let me just get you what you think about this. Are you concerned about what's happening?
I'm very concerned, Don. And you know, the last time I came on this show to talk with you, we spoke more about personal finance decisions among our society within the context of folks struggling to pay debt coming out of the student loan reprieve. But I made a point during that interview that our youth, our society as a whole, did not necessarily have a great example set for them in terms of tone at the top by our federal government. And when it comes to our federal government and its reckless spending policy, its quantitative easing, It's dovish economic policy. It's been quite irresponsible now going on decades. The scary part, though, is that the federal government has a printing press. Your average American can't print more money at home and cover their losses. The US government can, and it does. And it also issues more and more treasury bonds, takes on more and more debt with the public, and sometimes with other countries, and at times with our adversaries, like China. And so I'm happy to be here to talk to you today about that, because according to the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO, the U.S. is actually paying a record high amount of interest alone on the national debt right now. And I think the national debt sits around $32 trillion. And in about 20 years from now, the CBO says that interest payments could hit up to $5.5 trillion. That's trillions in interest. We're not talking about debt principal payments here. We're talking about interest. If it reaches that amount within the next 20 years, Don, that would be more than the U.S. currently spends on programs like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and defense. So interest rates are going up. The Fed has increased interest rates 11 times in the past 16 months, and they're at the highest level now that we've seen in over 20 years. The logical impact of that is that debt servicing costs, interest costs go up. They skyrocket for the U.S. government. So as the government issues more and more debt, as irresponsible as it might be, the interest costs associated with that debt are also very burdensome on the economy and on the U.S. government and its spending policy. So it's definitely concerning. I think we're headed towards a tipping point. I don't know how a nation can sustain itself doing this. Your average American can't sustain him or herself doing this. But our government, again, not exactly setting the best example. And I think it is lowering consumer or investor confidence in the nation's creditworthiness and in the strength in the U.S. dollar. It's very concerning.
All right, so you mentioned a lot of points there, and let me just go through them one at a time. You mentioned reckless spending. What does that look like? What is reckless spending to you?
Well, the late great economist Dr. Walter Williams, Don, from George Mason University, he actually once characterized our debt situation as an issue of morality. Right? He said, and I quote, that we've become an immoral people demanding that Congress forcibly use one American to serve the purpose of another. That right there is the very foundation of reckless spending, reckless debt incurrence. And we have programs in this country, yes, entitlement programs, some programs, which especially now during an election cycle, most politicians don't want to talk about much, such as Social Security. And that is, just specifically in terms of Social Security, a big source of why the government is incurring so much debt. Social Security, just as an example, as a microcosmic example of all the issues going on and the source of all this reckless spending, is pretty much running insolvent. The Board of Trustees of that program issue a report every year, Don, that says that it fails short-term and long-term solvency tests. And so to cover those shortfalls, the U.S. government, the Treasury, just keeps issuing more and more debt, and Social Security basically lives off of that to keep the program alive. And if you have all of these entitlement spending programs that aren't run very well, that are soon to run insolvent, the U.S. government finds itself in a position that it perceives it has no other choice other than to issue more debt in order to keep these programs alive. Otherwise, you're going to have what is happening in France and Nicaragua. People are rioting, they're protesting, they're concerned about the equivalent of Social Security payouts in those countries, and the fact that the retirement age has to go up, payroll taxes have to go up, et cetera, just to keep those types of programs alive. So programs like that are a huge source of our government spending and a huge reason why our government takes on so much debt. It is wholly irresponsible what we are doing in this country.
All right, so let me ask you this then. Our welfare payments, that's including Social Security and servicing the interest on our debt right now, is basically taking up 100% of our revenue. So everything else we pay is through debt. So we talk about, being responsible in our spending. I mean, where do you cut, right? You can't cut Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. I mean, you're not going to get reelected. So what do you think there?
You just summarized the issue perfectly. You can't cut Social Security, you won't get elected. If someone were to draw a picture for us, Don, of how Social Security functions, of how it gets money, of how it pays it out, of how it survives, that picture would be shaped like a pyramid. Oh, what is Derek saying? Is he saying Social Security is a pyramid scheme? I said what I said. You draw a picture of how it works, it's shaped like a pyramid. Bernie Madoff spent the rest of his years in jail for his pyramid scheme. US government runs one, and what do we have? Oh, well, we have a printing press in our backyard, so we can use that to continue to sustain this. It's failing the American people. By the way, it's failing the American people. And now we actually tell politicians we won't elect them unless they keep the scheme alive. It's not a compassionate program. I've told people, Don, these types of programs which are failing, which are running insolvency, they're not a compassionate program. To keep them alive, you're going to have to substantially increase the payroll taxes on the average working class American, or you're going to have to decrease scheduled payouts, according to the Social Security Board of Trustees, by at least 20% to keep this alive in the long term. So politicians can't get elected if they say they cut these programs. But Don, I'm afraid it might be what this country needs to do to stay afloat fiscally. Fitch just downgraded our credit rating from a AAA to a AA plus, citing economic turmoil in the past couple years and in future years and decreasing investor confidence in U.S. Treasury bonds. That's very concerning. That's now the second major credit rating agency to downgrade us in the last 10 years or so.
All right, let me just play the devil's advocate for a moment here. So you're saying this is what the country needs. I mean, what does that mean for the average American people who depend on Social Security? They're not going to be happy. I mean, how do you balance that?
Yeah, well, not saying that you cut the programs entirely and you hang our elderly out to dry, right? But the fact of the matter is that year in and year out, the Board of Trustees of Social Security issue, I don't want to call it an audit report, but they issue a report to Congress every year on the financial health of Social Security. And every year, the outlook gets worse. This latest report said that the program might run insolvent by 2034. That's actually a year sooner than they thought it would run insolvent last year, where it said 2035, I believe. So the situation, the financial wealth of the program is getting worse and worse. So I get the compassionate point of how do we hang people out to dry now? People are going to be upset and so forth. People are going to react a certain way if we say we're cutting these programs. But how are people going to react in 2035? The retirees, when they're retiring and they're getting far fewer benefits than they expected to receive, even receiving anything at all with an insolvent, bankrupt slush fund, right? So we can have the conversation about compassion and how people will react now to cutting spending. But that same conversation will need to happen if we continue on this road in, 11 years from now, when Social Security is expected to essentially go broke. So the conversations can happen now, they can happen a decade from now, they can happen 2 decades from now, they can happen 3 decades from now, when people are paying 4 percentage points higher on their payroll taxes and struggling to buy groceries, right? But the conversation needs to happen at some point. And I don't know if it's education, I don't know if it's a social reckoning of sorts, but this discussion needs to happen in a more serious way. And again, for your audience, in the middle of an election cycle right now, Republican primary, Democratic primary, and so forth, I'm telling you right now, any politician that tells you they can save Social Security or similar programs are lying to you, unless they do it by way of significantly increasing cost burdens for working class Americans. I want everyone to keep that in mind. Oh, this person flip-flopped on Social Security. This person's going to save it. This person's going to cut it. Anyone who tells you they can save it is lying to you. I want to make that very clear.
Wow. Okay. Let me just make one more comment on Social Security, and then we can move on to other parts of spending. So that's a very important point that for the long-term benefit of everyone, I think it's important that we have this discussion right now. There may be some economic pain that we may have to experience in the short term, but in the long run, it will be beneficial. That's your point.
That's my point. Now, there are options. There are very smart actuaries out there and market analysts and so forth who are much smarter than me who have proposed alternative solutions. In fact, you had a former finance professional who's a congressman go on MSNBC and other networks in the past, and he proposed that you, in a way, at least partially privatize these programs. And you take some of these payroll tax contributions people are making, and you put some of that into the S&P 500, into the NASDAQ, into the Dow Jones Industrial Index, and that over time, particularly over the last several decades, and even going back further, those returns have outperformed Social Security, which is essentially adjusted for inflation or has returns of slightly above inflation historically. I don't know that that's a bad idea. He got a lot of hell from people for that suggestion, Don. Oh, how could you even suggest privatizing these government programs? Government programs, don't you know, they work perfectly all the time. Well, we are on a crash course to a catastrophe, at least when it comes to Social Security. So I think our country should be open to many of these ideas, particularly ideas that suggest we ought to at least partially privatize these programs and get them in markets and in indexes that are proven to have more success than whatever the government is doing with your money.
Okay, so other parts of federal spending, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, $1.something trillion into the economy. So I want to pose this point. You know, if I'm being fair, we're spending a lot, but there's arguments that fiscal spending and injection of liquidity into the economy could actually keeping the recession that we've been talking about since last year, could be keeping the recession at bay.
Okay, so there are multiple camps of thought on this, right? I think our current, when you look at Janet Yellen, when she headed up the Fed and now she's heading up the Treasury, that's more dovish economic policy, right? That puts inflation completely off to the side and at all costs prioritizes preventing recessions and so forth. Printing more money, issuing more debt, injecting more into the money supply, keeping interest rates low for as long as you can. Of course, that's not happening anymore. But my question is, at what cost? Again, what it comes down to is our country has shouldered itself with an unfathomable amount of debt that may not sit on the shoulders of current generations, but will sit on the shoulders of generations yet born. It's unethical to do what our country is doing right now. I understand the point of injecting more into the money supply and preventing a recession. But right now, we also have interest rates going up, and it's suppressing consumer demand. And it's artificially trying to reduce inflation in a way that suggests that the government is blaming the private sector for inflation, which I find an absurd notion. So monetary policy right now, it seems a little contradictory to what the country wants in terms of economic growth, reducing inflation, and avoiding a recession.
Yeah, and let me just point something else out as well to our viewers. The U.S. is having a wartime level of deficit, and we're in a peacetime economy. It's incredible, Derek. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and actually, there was a report I had read years ago during the Obama administration that said that our deficits were the highest percentage of GDP since World War II, when we were funding the biggest war effort of all time. So despite also not being in an equal scale war, of course, at the time. So yeah, it's baffling, and it's irresponsible at the very least. I mean, the national debt's been an issue for quite some time, Don, for decades, but recently it's pretty grotesque in terms of how bad it's gotten. Our government, as a result of the pandemic too, decided to inject ungodly amounts of money to the economy and money supply. And as we know, this has resulted in crippling inflation for the average American consumer. and it's resulted in us taking on even more debt than we'd probably like. And how has the current administration reacted to this? Well, they've hiked interest rates, as we've mentioned, mercilessly, and spent more money. And as of September of last year, the Biden administration approved about $4.8 trillion in additional borrowing, and $1.8 trillion in addition for COVID relief, which has dragged on and on and on. And now we find ourselves in a situation where our credit worthiness is being downgraded on the global scale from AAA to AA plus. And as fears of a default loom, I don't think that bodes well for investor confidence in the US dollar. It just doesn't.
So you mentioned earlier about how servicing the interest payment on our debt could rise to above $1.4 trillion, something like that, in the year 2032. Do you think eventually the amount of interest that we'll have to pay will start to catch up with our total revenue, our total receipts?
I don't know. I don't know that will happen. By 2030, total interest on the national debt is going to reach over 3% of our GDP. This is just interest. Okay. We're lucky, Don, if we can even grow the GDP by more than 3% these days, right? But now we're on track to eclipse 3% in debt interest and servicing costs alone. And it's incredibly detrimental, particularly to our country's spending priorities, right? So for a nation to just shoulder itself in terms of interest debt like this, and to have to deal with astronomical interest costs and debt servicing costs, this is going to result in our nation's budget, or lack thereof of a budget, being disproportionately allocated to paying interests on debt that it can never repay. And when we're preoccupied with trillions in interest debt, it diverts our attention from meaningful public investment interests. And, Pew Research reported actually that this year alone, interest payments on our national debt are estimated to be $400 billion. That's $100 billion more than veterans benefits, primary, secondary education, disaster relief, agriculture, science and space programs, foreign aid, and environmental protection combined this year. So it's this interest on debt issue alone is a problem. And the way it's growing, I don't know that revenues coming in are going to catch up to it. When you look at the debt overall, I always tell people this too, who need more of a fundamental understanding of the situation. You could rob every single American of every single dollar that they earn and produce, and you could not pay off the national debt in a year. So politicians, particularly on the progressive side of things, prefer a progressive tax code. And that gets higher and higher for those who make more and more money. But again, another thing for your viewers, when it comes to an election cycle in particular, any politician that suggests a tax hike here and there on the wealthy, on the 1%, it can cover deficits and debt and so forth, they're lying to you. Again, you rob every single American of every dollar they produce and make, you still can't pay off the debt even in a year, maybe even 2 years. So you increase taxes here and there, it might help a little bit in the short term. It's not a solution. It's not a solution, and the repercussions are that it impacts the private sector in a way that we don't necessarily want it to be impacted.
Yeah, and the thing is, rich companies, big companies, they're the ones making the products that we buy. So if you increase the taxes on them, I mean, what's stopping them from passing on those costs, right? But here's another question for you.
They're all pass-through costs, exactly.
Yeah, right. If a family, for example, is spending 150% of their income, what would you say to that family?
It's a disastrous personal finance choice. Again, last time I was on this show, we were really focused on personal finance. I would tell a person that's doing that they're crazy. I'd say, show me your credit card statements. Holy cow, what's going on over here? You're absolutely right. At the peak, and I think the point where you're getting to is that, at the peak of the COVID pandemic, our nation's debt was over 130% of its GDP. So, of course, the correlation there is, like you would tell a family in America that they're crazy for spending 130% of the income they bring in and taking on and shouldering all this debt. we should be telling the government that it's crazy for the same. So yeah, absolutely a very valid point you've made there.
Okay, so start to wrap up here. How do we fix this? What are the solutions? Has the ship sailed?
I think the ship might have sailed, but as a country, we can't think that way. We're Americans. We problem solve. That's what we do. But I don't think the problem solves itself. We have to solve it. And the only way we can do that is through honest, imprudent discussions about where our money is being spent, particularly as it comes to these poorly run entitlement programs. I'm looking at Social Security. I'm looking at Medicare. Again, I don't lack compassion for people in America in need. I don't say we cut and we erase all these programs and leave folks out to dry. But there are alternative solutions that have been offered out there. Partial privatization, getting some of this money into the markets that have proven to outperform whatever the hell the government is doing with your money. And we don't fully know what the government is doing with their money. So to me, that is the first step towards a potential solution in the long term. But again, for years now, these programs, particularly Social Security, have been on track to run insolvent by the year 2035. It's a disgrace. It's concerning. It's an issue that I think Americans, per polling from Pew Research and AP and others, are starting to take more seriously and care about. 57% of Americans I saw in a poll care about the national debt as a serious issue. But that's not reflected in the agenda of our lawmakers. It's just not.
What do you think about increasing population growth of the U.S. so that you have more people in the workforce, more people contributing, more people paying taxes? It seems like the easiest way right now is just have more immigrants come into the country. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Open borders is a certain angle on that, but I think birth rates are a tremendous concern in the United States. Actually, the Board of Trustees of Social Security cited declining birth rates as a concern for why the program can't sustain itself. So when I brought up that controversial statement of alluding to the fact that Social Security is structured as a pyramid, that's the point I was making. You need more and more people to have more and more babies, to become workers, to contribute more and more at the bottom so that Social Security stays solvent and it can pay the retiring class at the top. But that is not happening at a rate that the program can sustain itself in the long term. And it's not just an issue for Social Security. It's an issue for other government-run programs that are structured in a similar manner. And it's an issue in other countries, such as Japan, such as France, such as several Central American countries, where they are in a state of riot right now at times because of this problem. And the way those governments have proposed a solution is just to increase the retirement age. So now you're going to work until you're 80, right, Don? And increase the payroll taxes and decrease the payouts and benefits. So you're hanging people out to dry anyways. They will work until they're dead before they can retire because they are relying on a defunct government-run retirement program. Again, people may think that I lack compassion in all of this. No. The government lacks compassion in all of this. They're running programs that are going to let our entire country down within 11 years. And in other parts of the world, to reiterate, it has already happened.
And just final question, you mentioned has already happened in other countries. I think Japan is a very similar parallel to the United States. I think maybe they're a bit worse off by a few years. But, for a long time, we've been talking that, Japan is on this trajectory of as if they were a fly in search of a windshield. And then we've been talking about this for decades, and yet Japan is still here. Do you think the U.S. is perhaps many decades into the future where we're actually going to see something break?
I think, and and people can keep me honest on the statistics and whether they back this up. I admittedly haven't looked into this too deeply, but I would imagine that a healthy birth rate is at least correlated with a healthy economy. In other words, if you think you're going to bring children into the world, into a strong economy, into a place where they're set up for success, you may be more inclined to have more children. And if you don't, you may be inclined to have fewer children or no children at all. On the progressive side of things, you'll hear some of their economic theorists say that's a good thing we're having fewer children because the world is overpopulated, the United States is overpopulated, and it causes environmental issues, right? Climate change and so forth. But these same progressives, Don, they don't want to cut Social Security. They don't want to cut these programs that rely on a healthy birth rate. You can't have it both ways. You can't suggest that it's great we have a lower birth rate because of the impact on the environment and the climate, but we also need to keep these programs alive that literally depend on a healthy birth rate. It's nonsensical, at least to me.
All right, very comprehensive discussion today. Thank you so much for your time, Derek.
I appreciate it as always, Don. Thanks for having me on. I look forward to next time.